Welcome back to Chinese religion. This video, part 10, is about Buddhism, Daoism, and Confucianism during the Sui and Tang Dynasties. The Sui Dynasty emerged after the chaotic, disunited Six Dynasties period. And it didn't last that long, just a few decades, but it represented a return to unified national imperial government. So it helped to reunite the country after the centuries of relative unrest. The Tang Dynasty lasted longer than the Sui, and after the Han, it was one of the most influential Chinese dynasties on later Chinese culture and religion. During this period, Daoism was the state religion promoted by many of the Tang emperors. So Daoism, religious Daoism, was at its maximum influence during the Tang. It never went away after the Tang Dynasty, but it also never attained the same degree of support by the emperors. Buddhism was also quite popular with both elite scholars and nobles and commoners during the Tang Dynasty. And this was the period in which Chan Buddhism specifically developed a lot of its most famous and influential masters. The tales of these masters, their teachings, their interactions with their students were preserved in Chan lore, where you can still hear these stories taught today. For example, not only in China, but also in other East Asian countries where they have Chan Buddhism, Korea, Japan, Vietnam. Confucianism was not supported as consistently during the Tang as it had been during the Han, but it did receive state support. There was a revival of the Confucian examination system, for example. So Emperor Gaozu of Tang was the founder of the Tang Dynasty, and he made Daoism the state religion. Specifically, he promoted the highest clarity school of Daoism, or sect of Daoism. Sima Chengchen was an important patriarch or head of the highest clarity school, and his approach was to emphasize inner alchemy, meditation, self-cultivation practices for health and longevity, as opposed to practicing or emphasizing outer alchemy or ritualistic worship of gods or goddesses. It's not to say that that went away, but those were his particular emphases in Taoism, this more kind of philosophical, scholarly, and self-cultivation approach. He also combined Buddhist with Taoist meditation techniques. So even though the Taoist meditation techniques had some influence on Chan Buddhism, for example, the influence was two ways. So Buddhist breath meditation entered into Taoism as well. Emperor Xinzong was another supporter of Taoism. He actually established colleges, schools, or academies for the study of Taoism. He included the Tao Te Ching in the state examination systems. So this was basically an outlier. For most of Chinese history, when the imperial government had the examination system to qualify people for administrative posts in the government, it was mainly the Confucian classics, the five books, or the five classics or the four books. But during this period, the Tao Te Ching was also included. He also ordered or oversaw the construction of thousands of Taoist monasteries. So according to the traditional numbers, 1,137 for Daoshi or male priests, and 550 for Nu Guan. That's the name for female priests in Taoism. So this is a lot of material support for Taoism and also supporting Taoist literature and learning alongside that of Confucianism. Confucianism did not go away during the Tang. So an example of this is Emperor Daizong, who constructed a new academy or great learning for the study of the Confucian classics, similar to what had existed under the Han Dynasty. He also built Confucian temples across the empire. So Confucianism over the centuries developed a distinctly religious aspect, you might say. In the Confucian temples, also called temples of learning or temples of culture, there were rituals honoring heaven, earth, Confucius himself, the Duke of Zhou, and other ancestors of the emperors. Over time, there developed a tradition of having images or just tablets naming Confucius, his 72 disciples or chief students, and the 12 wise ones, which were 12 other Confucian sages, basically, such as Mencius or Mengzi. these were beings that could be honored at these temples of learning. Confucianism during the Tang Dynasty is also represented by Han Yu. He was a Confucian scholar who was critical of Buddhism and Daoism, which were very influential during this period. Confucianism had fallen into relative decline, so he sought to revive the importance of Confucianism. One thing he did in particular was emphasize that Confucianism is not only for scholars or the elites, it's for the common people as well. So first of all, he advocated for the study and revival of classic literature. This is the literature of the Zhou and Han dynasties, for example. He linked private virtue of individual people and their families with civic duty to the government and society as a whole. So the Confucian virtues were not just about being loyal to your family above everything, but that could be connected to your family loyalty, your honoring your parents, can be connected to your loyalty to society and to the emperor. He opposed Buddhism as a foreign religion. He thought that both Buddhism and Daoism, because of their monastic traditions, conflicted with the Confucian virtues of honoring your parents, your ancestors, and paying attention to your family life. And one of the ways that Confucianism was popularized during this period was having people of all classes perform rituals honoring Confucius and other sages and figures within Confucianism. And even if you weren't a highly literate or educated scholar, you could still perform these rituals in the temples of learning. So you could be connected to supporting the values of Confucianism in that way. Buddhism during the Tang Dynasty was represented in part by Empress Wu. She was the only woman, as far as I know, to bear the title of Empress in the history of China. There were other women who had the power behind the throne, but they never actually got the title. And she basically used Buddhism to try to justify her rule. She claimed to be a female incarnation of Maitreya Buddha, and who is prophesied in a previous text named the Great Cloud Sutra to bring peace and a new age, kind of similar to that earlier Taoist text, the Dai Bing Jing. This was a Buddhist version of that idea of a kind of new age that would dawn when Maitreya came back in a new incarnation. She claimed actually to be that incarnation. She was supported in that by some of her advisors and Buddhist clergy. However, towards the end of the Tang Dynasty, Buddhism suffered a major setback. It was persecuted by Emperor Wu at the behest of the Taoist priests whom he supported. This led to the decline of many Buddhist schools. Chan Buddhism and Jingtu, or Pure Land, were kind of the two main schools of Buddhism after that, but several of the older schools died out after the persecution. The Chan Buddhism really developed a lot of its most famous teachers and doctrines during the Tang Dynasty. So Hui Neng is the sixth patriarch or head of the Chan school in China. According to the traditional account, which you can read in the Platform Sutra, also called the Sutra of Hui Neng, he was from a poor family, he was illiterate, and even though actually, if you read the story carefully, he is Han Chinese, he's not a minority. His father was a scholar official who worked for the government. He fell into political disgrace. Really, he had some political enemy who went after him, so he had to leave the government. He traveled to the south, and he died when Hui Neng was young. So Hui Neng was from the family of a scholar or official. However, because his father died when he was young, he was raised by his mother. They didn't have a lot of money. He had to chop wood for a living. And because he was raised in this province that the majority of the people he was living around were not ethnically Chinese, he came to adopt their language and manner. So he would have been regarded as a foreigner by the ethnic Chinese that he later on interacted with. Well, part of the story of Hui Neng is that he has a kind of sudden enlightenment experience early in his life. The first time he hears of Buddhism, he hears a layperson chanting a sutra, he has a kind of aha moment, this kind of shock of recognition. He realizes not only does he gain some actual insight into the Buddhist Dharma right then and there, he realizes his religious vocation or calling to become a monk and ultimately a teacher. So he gets permission from his mother to do this. He's able to get money as a gift from a friend of the family, if I recall correctly, who was also a Buddhist. Basically, he's giving this money to his mother to take care of her. He's fulfilling his filial duties as a son in order to take on this religious vocation. And it's a long story of how he goes to the monastery. He's basically discriminated against because he's regarded as poor. He can't read, he's illiterate, so the thought is he can't be a good scholar of Buddhism, etc. But he ends up showing that his understanding of the Dharma is actually the most profound, and the fifth patriarch chooses him as his successor over the senior student Shun Hishu. So the dispute over the succession between Huineng and Shen Hishu is often illustrated by this conflict in the early history of Chan between gradual enlightenment doctrine and sudden enlightenment doctrine. This issue would become a sort of recurring theme in Chan Buddhism. At least according to traditional accounts, there were different kind of like emphases among different teachers of Chan. In the north, they taught the gradual enlightenment approach, in which you practice meditation for years and years to gradually polish and perfect your mind, similar to the Confucian idea of having to gradually learn the classics and follow the examples of moral role models in order to become a junsa. So this is the idea of meditating for years and years, gradually perfecting yourself. The sudden enlightenment is that you are already awakened. You already have Buddha nature within you. So all you have to do is have an intuitive look into your true nature and you can be awakened right away. At least in principle, it can happen suddenly and immediately. And this was associated with the so-called Southern School of Chan and with Huineng in particular because of his early enlightenment experience, his aha moment in hearing the sutra being recited. Now, even though he had that sudden awakening, it was not regarded as a full awakening. He did have to practice more. But something else about the story of Huineng that fits in with this is the idea that he actually learned about Buddhism through working in the monastery. He was regarded as of an inferior social position, so they didn't let him become a monk at first. He was just a worker or a servant there, and he was pounding rice for one of his main jobs. Well, he was able to actually practice meditation when engaging in this repetitive task, and that became a very important theme in later Chan Buddhism, that there's an integration between meditation practice and the rest of your life. Yes, they do practice sitting meditation, but there's also a notion that you can train your mind just through working and even through perhaps your relationships with other people. Well, they had a kind of contest between Shen Hishu and Huineng, and the fifth patriarch said whoever can compose the verse or gata, it's a 4-line poem, that expresses the teaching better will be my successor, and Huineng was able to do it despite his background. Now, Huineng himself says that there's actually no dichotomy between gradual and sudden enlightenment, and this does express the idea you see in a lot of Chan texts, that the non-dual approach, this more holistic, unified understanding of reality. And you can really see both of these themes, gradual and sudden, in later Chan texts. On the one hand, they do practice meditation very diligently over many years. That's a kind of gradual approach, but there's also an expectation that the awakening experience or things leading up to it can happen suddenly, where it's a kind of intuitive penetration deeper into the nature of reality, deeper into the nature of the Buddha mind. So a little bit more about Chan meditation. So there's a couple of terms used in Chan Buddhism. Duo Chan just means sitting meditation. And this is practiced similar to other Buddhists where a common theme is the breath. That's not unique to Chan, even though they emphasize practicing it as kind of like one of their main things, as opposed to also emphasizing rituals or mantras, honoring a sutra or a god. Qiguan Dacuo means just sitting. And this is a type of meditation that's pretty unique to Chan Buddhism. It's sitting meditation without having any theme or subject of concentration. So you're not focusing on the breath, you're not focusing on the mantra, you're just sitting. And this may relate to the descriptions of Bodhidharma's wall contemplation, where he's just sitting facing the wall of a cave. So there's different ways of interpreting this, but on one interpretation, it may have been influenced by the Taoist sitting forgetting practice in the Chuang-Tzu, where you're not having any specific theme or idea in your mind. However, you're not just being careless or unconscious or falling asleep or getting unfocused. Instead, you're kind of just directing your awareness directly on itself. The idea is this can prompt a deep insight into Buddha nature, or the nature of mind itself as being pure. Another distinctive Chan practice is the gong-an. This is literally translated as case record. Evidently, this originally applied in a legal context in which the record of a previous legal case could be used as a precedent for later ones. How does this relate to Chan? Well, these were stories, records of stories of teaching between master and student. And the idea was a previous teaching by a Chan master could be a precedent to give you insight in the later time or later generation. So these would typically be in the form of a short story of an often puzzling or paradoxical interaction between a Chan master and student. And the idea is these set up a puzzle, but the puzzle does not have a rational solution. It's not like solving a crossword or something. You have to contemplate the gong-an as a meditation topic, and you will solve it not by coming to some verbal or rational answer, but by using this as a kind of technique or prod to see deeper into your own mind. So an example of a gong-an is Cao Chou's Wu. So Cao Chou was an early Chan master, and a student of his came up to him and said, "Does a dog have a Buddha nature?" And Cao Chou's answer was Wu, or no, or not. This is just a character of Wu in Chinese that I have on the slide on the right. So this is paradoxical in a Buddhist context because Mahayana Buddhists who believe in Buddha nature typically believe that all sentient beings have Buddha nature, and a dog is a sentient being. So doctrinally speaking, the answer should be yes. But the Wu is not being interpreted literally as an answer to the question. It's a rejection of the thought process behind the question itself. So one way of interpreting this gong-an is that the student is thinking of Buddhism as a series of doctrines that he can know with his mind, rationally or verbally. All he has to do is ask the right questions. He'll get the right answers. Maybe if he memorizes or understands those answers, then his mind will be awakened. Well, that's not the view of Chan Buddhism. So the master Cao Chou is rejecting the question as if to say, look, you cannot understand Buddhism by asking questions like that. You have to look into your own mind, perhaps, and you will find the answers. And this is one example of a long list of gong-an. There are several important collections of gong-an. Two of the most important are the Blue Cliff Record and the Wu Men Guan, or Gateless Barrier. These are used not only in Chinese Chan, but in Japanese Zen as well.